Good afternoon. My name is Henry Lee, and I want to welcome you to the Energy Policy Seminar. I'm the director of the Environment and Natural Resource Program at the Belfer Center here at the Kennedy School, one of the sponsors of this seminar, along with the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government and the Harvard University Center for the Environment. Let me open with a few reminders regarding the logistics of our online seminar. We are recording it and it will be posted on the seminar series website. So if you have a friend or a colleague who misses this talk, please let them know that they can watch it on the seminar webpage. And we have registration links for the next few seminars in our series. We will take questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. Please click on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type your questions. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Professor Michael McElroy. He is the Gilbert Butler Professor of Environmental Studies at Harvard. He is the author of more than 250 journals, 3 books, 3 edited books, and more than 30 articles in Nature and Science. At Harvard, he heads up the Harvard-China Project on Energy, Economy, and Environment, which has collaborated for more than 20 years with colleagues in China to advance environment, climate, and energy issues. He was the founding director of the Harvard University Center on the Environment and the founding chair of the Department of Earth and Planetary Science. For 30 years, he has been a major intellectual leader on both climate science and climate policy, and it's our great honor to have him as our guest this afternoon. Michael?
Henry, thank you for that overly generous introduction. You know, the interesting piece of history about the China project that you mentioned is that it began, I think, in 1992, and then Vice President Al Gore was a major prompter for us to try to get involved with this. And what I remember is that we invited a senior Chinese government official to give a talk actually at the Kennedy School. And after he gave his talk, I sort of started talking to him. I said, look, we would really be interested in trying to develop a Harvard-China project. And he said, don't try to convince me. He said, I've already been convinced by the vice president. He said, of course, I will sponsor your activity in China. So ever since then, this has been an interesting activity. And we've had a lot of fun and had opportunities to work with a lot of smart people. And I would like to acknowledge the colleagues here, in particular Chris Nielsen, who's been a real talent in terms of bringing this thing together. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about the potential for offshore wind in China, and specifically prospects for a source of green hydrogen. And I'm going to talk about a few very recent papers that I think are relevant to where we are at the moment in terms of thinking about the challenges that we face for dealing with climate change in a cooperative way. So let me begin with a slide that shows the large investments that China has made over the years in onshore wind. And you can see it's a pretty impressive number in terms of the cumulative investment. There's more installed wind capacity in China than in any other part of the world. In fact, a significant fraction of the total wind capacity is in fact in China. Now, at the same time, if you look at the next chart, the moving target that I'm going to talk about today is the question of opportunities for offshore wind in China. And the reason this is particularly important is that if you look at the next chart, if you look at the this is a study that we did over 10 years ago on
yeah, I don't know why.
I guess you can't see that, can you? No. Well, I'll just talk about it. What the study we did a number of years ago pointed out that the wind capacity onshore wind capacity in China is particularly strong in the northern region. but the demand for electricity is particularly strong in the coastal region, to the point where 80% of the total electricity consumed in China is actually consumed in these coastal provinces. So there's some sense of a mismatch between where the onshore electricity could be produced from wind and where the demand really is. And the net effect of that has been that over the last number of years, there's been a significant amount of curtailed electricity in the northern regions of China, curtailed because during winter, there's a demand for hot water to heat homes just at a time when the wind is really blowing. And so if you don't have an opportunity for the wind, you sort of have to turn off the turbines. And so it's an enormous waste with an estimated dollar value of waste of over $1.2 billion over the last number of years. So that's a little bit of the background. So this is the motivation for turning into now talking about the opportunities for offshore wind. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off on where the offshore wind opportunities really are in China, how much is there, and I'm also going to talk about the cost of bringing that electricity onshore. Then after I do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about some more recent work that we have been doing on opportunities for green hydrogen. Next slide. So the methodology that we're using here is what we've done over the years. We're using NASA simulated meteorology at a resolution of at a significantly high resolution globally. And what we're doing here is we're using this meteorology to look at what the wind opportunity is at a turbine height of 100 meters. And we're going to look at this with the simulated meteorology over the period 1980 to 2019. So we've been doing this for a significant amount of time. Now, in doing this offshore wind, we're going to obviously restrict our attention to the economic zone for China. We're also going to restrict our attention to water depths of less than 60 meters. And we're also, during the study, we're going to exclude environmentally defined zones of sensitivity, and also we're going to exclude shipping lanes. So that's sort of the background to what we're trying to do here. We're also going to do this calculation assuming an 8 megawatt Vestas turbine to calculate what the potential capacity factor is for these winds over a typical year. And we're going to do this also assuming that that we have some sense of what the hourly demand for electricity is in these coastal provinces and in fact in China as a whole. And that will be an important part of how we decide to use this information. In terms of costing, we're going to look at two estimates that have been available recently for the cost of installing these turbines, capital cost, low cost, $2,000 per kilowatt, high cost, $3,500 per kilowatt. And in doing the calculation of how much electricity you can produce, we're going to also consider the cost of bringing the power onshore. We're going to consider the cost of maintaining these turbines. So it's essentially an inclusive study of what you might expect to be able to produce and at what price. A little bit of background. The development of offshore wind has been particularly impressive in Europe. And for example, in terms of offshore wind, the UK has been #1, Germany #2, Denmark 3, Netherlands 4, and Belgium #5. And this has been mostly developments in the North Sea, exploiting for the most part the technology that was used to drill for natural gas. And this is now caught on to the point where costs to maintain and to develop the system have dropped very significantly over recent years. And a number of you may remember that a few years ago in the middle of the Trump administration, there was a lease of offshore wind potential in the United States. And to the great surprise of people, that lease realized that an enormous amount of money, I think it was $260 million for 3 leases. And this is a big surprise. And every single one of these 3 successful people or groups had a European connection. And why were they doing it? Well, they had done the calculation and estimated that they could bring power onshore at a cost of 7.4 cents a kilowatt hour, decreasing over a decade or so to 0.65 cents, 6.5 cents a kilowatt hour. And that would mean that the delivery cost, the retail cost of electricity from this offshore wind would be competitive with natural gas in the New England region. And that was a real game changer in terms of the way we started to think about this thing. So if this is going to be so economically viable in the US, then we thought, well, why don't we look and see what the potential is for China? And what we found out is, as we started to do this calculation, is that, first of all, the offshore ocean in China, out to a significant distance, close to the end of the economic zone, is relatively shallow water. So the opportunity to plant these turbines in sediments in water depths of less than 60 meters is really, really impressive. And so that was what motivated this calculation that we did. And this chart here is sort of summarizing on a province by province basis what the offshore capacity is in gigawatts, what the offshore energy potential is in terawatt hours, and then looking at what the peak demand for power on a province by province basis is in gigawatts, and what the energy demand in over the course of a year is measured in terawatt hours. And then the last column here is giving you the ratio of offshore energy potential to demand. And so what you see is that the number is pretty impressive in terms of potential for on a province by province basis. Now, of course, that's telling you about potential. Now, the next question is, what's the cost to deliver this electricity? And the next chart, I think, is sort of giving you a visual summary of what the distribution of capacity factors is on a province by province basis. And on the right-hand side, the estimate of what the cost of delivering the electricity is on a province by province basis. And as we'll see, there's a very significant potential to deliver cost competitive electricity on a province by province basis that is really, really impressive. And there's some mismatch between the capacity factor of distribution and the actual levelized cost of generating electricity, which reflects the question of how far are you from shore in terms, what's the cost of essentially bringing the power on shore. Next. Okay, so this chart is a little bit complicated, but what we're doing here is summarizing the results of this analysis. And the number E is a measure of the economic potential, essentially looking at low cost and high cost for 2020 and low cost and high cost for 2030. And R is the ratio of what you could deliver relative to what the demand is on a province by province basis. So if I turn over and look at the potential for 2030, what you see here is that there's at the low cost level, you can essentially replace most of the economic demand for electricity at a cost that's less than the current cost of producing that electricity from, mostly in these provinces, from imported coal. So that's a little bit of the background. Now, let me sort of move on a little bit. This is a visual summary of the levelized cost of electricity on the total offshore coastal region. And the vertical dashed line that you see here is the current cost of delivering electricity from coal-fired power plants. And the blue line, dashed line, is the current cost of delivering electricity from existing nuclear power plants. And the range that you see here is for low cost and the high cost, the low cost being the $2,000, the high cost, the higher estimate that we have. And I actually frankly think that these costs are going to come down very significantly according to some of the analysis that really have been done. But the bottom line here is that you can replace most of the electricity that is required in the coastal regions at a cost that's competitive or cheaper than the existing costs. So that is the first topic that I wanted to discuss. And so conclusions, China has a significant physical potential for offshore wind. The offshore potential is about 5.4 times larger than the demand for the individual coastal provinces. Offshore wind is underutilized and a cheap resource that can currently supply 36 to 200% of the total coastal province demand at a cost competitive price, which I think we estimate to be something like 7 to 8 cents a kilowatt hour, and even more in 2030. So that's the first topic I wanted to discuss. And I want to now move to talking a little bit about some more recent work that we have been doing. And so what we're going to talk about here is the potential to use, well, this is a paper that we published a few years ago on the economic cost of producing green hydrogen from wind. In this particular paper is for doing this thing in Western Inner Mongolia. And the overall conclusion is that you can produce a green hydrogen in Western Inner Mongolia at a cost that's competitive with current costs of producing it from largely coal and industrial sources, largely from coal in that particular region. Next time. A little bit of background, just language here. Gray hydrogen is hydrogen that's produced from either natural gas or coal. And on a global basis, it's mostly produced from natural gas. In China, up to now, it's been mostly produced from coal. And 1 kilogram of hydrogen is associated with emissions of at least 10 kilograms of CO2. That's 10 kilograms if you're using natural gas as the feedstock, even more, obviously, if you're using coal. Blue hydrogen, the idea is that blue hydrogen means that you're going to try to capture the CO2 and bury it in some form, but still produce the hydrogen from natural gas or coal. Then green hydrogen is the ideal situation where you're going to produce the hydrogen from electrolysis, and you're going to use carbon-free electricity to do this. Okay, next. What I'm now going to do is tell you a little bit about a study that we have done on the delivery of hydrogen to Japan. And about a little bit of background here. The current demand for hydrogen in Japan is 1.3 megatons per year, and it's consumed largely in the industrial sector, including oil refinery and for production of ammonia and petrochemicals. But the interesting fact is that the Japanese government has set a target to have a future energy system that's going to be largely significantly dependent on hydrogen. And a significant part of that hydrogen is probably going to be imported. And I'll talk about that. And so the target that the Japanese government has set is to have a target of 20 megatons of hydrogen per year of low carbon hydrogen consumption by 2050. That would be equivalent to 20% of final energy consumption in Japan, and an interim target of 3 megatons of hydrogen per year in 2030. And remember, the current industrial demand for hydrogen in Japan is 1.3 megatons of hydrogen per year. So that's a little bit of the sense. I'm sorry?
Just give me the time.
Okay. So the next chart is, Peter was giving me a warning here. The next chart is showing the
This is
the Japanese government targets. So the target is to ensure a supply of hydrogen by 2030 at a cost of $3 per kilogram, declining to $2 per kilogram by 2050. And the ultimate target in the Japanese government is to have the price for hydrogen equivalent to the projected future price of natural gas, which they assume they take a number of $10 per million BTU, and that would correspond to $1.4 per kilogram of hydrogen. And they recognize that there's a mismatch between what they're talking about for 2030 and 2050. And what they say is that, okay, the target price for green hydrogen in 2050 could be higher than these target prices simply because of the premium that you would attach to the environmental benefit of this green hydrogen source. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, so Japan is currently assuming that it will, the hydrogen will be supplied largely from foreign sources, from Australia, New Zealand, Brunei, Saudi Arabia, and Norway. As far as I can see, the idea is that you bring in this hydrogen, but you assume that the country that's producing the hydrogen has at least taken care of the carbon. So there's some discussion, for example, that the coal source that would produce the hydrogen in Australia will be complemented by carbon capture and sequestration. But so far, that's not actually the case. I mean, the hydrogen that's being produced in Australia is, in fact, it's essentially gray hydrogen. It's not hydrogen that's balanced by carbon capture and sequestration. Some of these other sources that are talked about, you can imagine Saudi Arabia, Norway, possibly a source that would be related to hydro as a source. So the projected cost for 2030 in the Japanese analysis is $3 to $4 per kilogram for green hydrogen and $3 to $7 per kilogram for blue hydrogen. Okay, next. So we've done this analysis of what the distribution of cost for hydrogen would be as a function of different provinces in China. And the bottom line here is that you can produce, we believe you can produce hydrogen at a rate that is lower than the Japanese government is thinking about, and also competitive with any potential imported source of hydrogen from the countries that we mentioned. Now, in doing this analysis, a pretty complicated analysis that we have done here, next chart will give you a sense of the way we're going to do this. The first question is, obviously, how do you produce the hydrogen? And we're producing this hydrogen in our analysis here using offshore wind, and we're producing it essentially as green hydrogen produced from offshore wind with one of three possible electrolysis systems, the cheapest at the moment being the alkaline system. Then the other question we have to think about is, okay, how are we going to get the hydrogen that we're going to produce in coastal regions of China to Japan? And we explore a number of possibilities. One is you essentially bind the hydrogen, the green hydrogen, up with a chemical, this MCH chemical. And so you deliver the hydrogen by ship, essentially in liquid form with its chemical binding. And then you release the hydrogen when you get to the Japanese port, and you recycle the chemical toluene back to the original destination source of the hydrogen. Another way in which you can do it is you turn the hydrogen into ammonia. So you now have a source of green ammonia, and you transmit that green ammonia to Japan. And the green ammonia obviously can replace current sources of ammonia in Japan to get rid of the industrial source. It also could be used to as a liquid to essentially burn the ammonia and produce electricity in that particular fashion. Or if you really want a source of hydrogen, you would have to spend some energy and money to turn the ammonia into a source of hydrogen. Then the third source is liquid hydrogen. And from our analysis, this is probably not the preferred way to do it, because you have to spend a significant amount of money to liquefy the hydrogen. And the cheapest way to do it, as these numbers suggest, is the MCH, the chemical bonder, where you can deliver hydrogen, we believe, to Japan at a cost of $2 per kilogram, which is significantly less than the current Japanese ambitious cost for 2030. And here are the numbers for 2030 and for 2050. So production of hydrogen from offshore wind in China, we think, can be cost competitively supplied to Japan. That, I think, is an interesting new piece of information. The paper describing this has just been accepted in Nature Communications. Okay, the other thing I want to discuss is, next chart. This is a paper that just came out in Joule this week. And it's a paper that is, I think, clearly immediately getting a lot of attention. We've had a whole series of requests to talk with various reporters from around the world. So I thought it'd be good for me to at least give you a sense of what the issue is here. So what we're doing in this particular paper, this Joule paper, is we are looking at the opportunities to reduce electricity and to satisfy energy demands in China with a target year of 2050. And it's a very complicated model developed by our friends, Jinyu Chen, who was here for about 4 or 5 years and is now back in China. What the analysis does is it considers every single province in China, and it considers the hourly demand for electricity, the hourly demand for an entire year. And it also considers what the thermal capacity is on a province by province basis, including the startup costs and the turn-off costs and so on of operating the thermal system. It includes the existing nuclear system and hydro, and onshore and offshore wind and solar. So those are the inputs to the electricity generation part of this particular system. But in doing the analysis, it also considers opportunities for storage of electricity. One of the obvious problems that you have here is that if you're including a significant amount of electricity, so a significant amount of electricity from renewable sources, you have the problem of the renewable sources being variable. How do you deal with that? So we consider the opportunities for storage. We also consider the opportunities for green hydrogen to replace current industrial use and to be used also in heavy duty vehicles for an expansion. And we also consider expansion of the national transmission network for both AC and DC strategies. And we also look at, given that China has plans for a very large fleet of EVs, electrically propelled vehicles, we look at the opportunities for both slow and fast charging of these EVs. So it's a very complicated model. And let me sort of just summarize some of the basic conclusions here. The conventional strategy would imagine using local wind, local solar, local storage, and imply a significant charge for decarbonization. If you do that analysis, the charge for decarbonization would amount to, according to this analysis, $27 a ton to sequester carbon. And this is assuming that you're looking at accommodating 80% renewables by 2050. Okay, then next analysis is, okay, suppose you coordinate deployment of renewables and ultra high voltage transmission and storage, and you also take a national view of what is possible to do this. And the cost then drops to a little less than $10 a ton. Then if you also look at green hydrogen production and deployment in the industrial sector and in the heavy duty transport vehicles, combining this with a preference for slow charging EVs, the conclusion of this analysis is that you could actually lower the carbon abatement charge to a negative value of minus $1.6 per ton. So I think that this is an amazing result, and I think not surprisingly, it's going to get some attention. Now, since we're only accommodating 80% renewables by 2050, if the Chinese plan is to decarbonize the economy by 2060, if not earlier, then what do you do with the balance? Well, and one thing you can do is you can use a carbon capture and sequestration to make up for the difference. Number two, you could use managing the biosphere as to provide a sink for carbon. We've had a number of papers that have looked at that, including producing biochar from crop waste and returning the biochar to the field. I mean, with possible benefits to the agricultural system in doing that. Or the other thing that we haven't talked about in this particular paper is that you can actually imagine using the hydrogen that you're producing here as a way to offset some of the variability of the renewable sources. And we also have a paper that has done this in the Indian context and argues that we could also decarbonize India by 2050 at a cost acceptable level compared to business as usual. So I think that what I should probably do, I think Henry's instruction was to keep this to about 30 minutes, and I think I'm about there. And so let me just click to the references here. These papers are all available. You can click on our China project website and just click and look at those and other papers that we produced over the number of years, and these being some of the more recent publications. So thank you for your attention. Can't hear you, Henry.
I know, I have to unmute myself. Thank you very much for a terrific and provocative set of papers. Can you drill down a little bit on the cost figures in your last chart? How did you come up with $27 a ton all the way down to a minus or negative figure? So what are the assumptions behind that?
Okay, it's a very complicated model, and the paper is a tough read. But what is done in the paper is to look at the minimum cost to satisfy a given demand for energy. And so if you're doing this, there's a significant cost associated on the first one of these conclusions. There's a significant cost because you're investing in 80% renewables, but there's a downtime, a significant time that the renewables are not actually able to meet the demand. And so you're curtailing the renewables. And of course, you're also invoking a significant thermal source to be able to meet the projected demand for 2050. And so then the next thing was to say, okay, part of the problem and the reason for the cost here is that you're trying to satisfy demand on a province by province basis. Okay, if you now start investing in the transmission system, both high voltage AC and DC, then you can nationalize this to some extent the efficiencies in meeting the demand with these 80% renewables. And that has the effect, according to this analysis. Again, the analysis is designed to minimize the cost of satisfying a given objective. So the cost pops down, measuring the cost in terms of CO2 emissions, it pops down to $9.9 a ton. Then if you go on now to think about the green hydrogen production and deployment, and specifically in this analysis, we only look at the deployment of green hydrogen, specifically in the industrial sector. Production of ammonia, the refinery source, and so on, and also then introduce hydrogen as a way of driving the heavy-duty transport vehicles. And then in addition to that, given that we're projecting a very large number of EVs in this 2050 kind of target time, we then say, okay, if ideally you would like to charge your EVs during the off-peak demand time. And so that's what we mean by slow charging. Now, admittedly, there will be some charging at offices and fast charging, and we include that as well based on some information that's available from experience with EVs in Beijing in particular. And so when you do that analysis, the carbon abatement charge drops to a negative value. And so it's as I said, it's a complicated analysis, but it's not biased in a way to get the results that you get. I mean, the input is the hourly production, the hourly demand for electricity every hour for a typical year for every province, and also accelerating the demand to 2050, assuming that you have a certain growth rate in the economy, and that's part of built into this thing. It includes every single thermal power system that is available in every province, including looking at the expense and energy expense of having to turn on a coal-fired power plant when you really need it and turning it off. So it's a pretty amazing job that Jinyu has done here in developing this story. And as I said, I'm not surprised that we're getting deluged with requests for comment, not just in Europe and the West, or the US, but specifically in China. I mean, this is obviously getting the attention of sources in China, particularly leading up to the COP.
I would urge everybody who is watching to put their questions in the Q&A, and I will forward them to Michael. Let me continue down the same path for a second. If I go back to your second paper, the one on offshore wind and ammonia being produced through green hydrogen, and then the ammonia being shipped to Japan. Wind, even offshore wind, and even in very good conditions, is intermittent. So are you backing this up with, in the southern part of China, you can back it up with hydro, but in the northern part of China, you would probably be backing it up with cycling coal facilities, which are going to be priced at whatever they're normally priced at, since for a part of the time, the ammonia production, which is in many cases 24/7, is not going to follow, is going to need power when it's not windy. So how do you deal with the intermittency in the production of ammonia?
Okay, I think that's an interesting question. Let me sort of just comment that one of the big conclusions of this analysis is that the availability of wind onshore in China is seasonally variable, and it tends to be highest in winter and lowest in summer. But also, it turns out that the availability of wind onshore in China is actually decreasing, we believe, due to the climate change effect. Essentially, what's happening is the monsoonal circulation is being influenced by the differential warming of the land relative to the ocean. But the interesting thing is that in terms of the offshore wind in this analysis, the offshore wind is relatively constant. It doesn't have that particular seasonal variability, and it isn't declining over the last 30 years as is the source on land. But you still have this question of how to make sure that you're going to run the ammonia facility at an economic level with a reasonable capacity factor. But if you're able to deliver the electricity from differential sources, differential provinces with the transmission buildup that we're talking about here, then I think you can do it. I think that's built into this particular analysis. It's I think it's a surprising result.
So these ammonia plants would work off of the existing thermal capacity when with sequestration when it is not windy offshore, pretty much?
No, I think the idea here is that you would produce hydrogen from the electrolysis system, and you would turn the hydrogen into ammonia in the conventional way. So the ammonia is being produced from green hydrogen. Consequently, the ammonia is also green.
But still, the electrolysis unit would have to be operating when it's not windy offshore, I would think.
Well, that's correct, except that remember, we're producing over the course of the year, we're producing potentially a surplus of the electricity that you need from the offshore source. And remember also in this Joule paper, we are envisaging coupling provinces electronically or transmission system, so that you're not going to be short of a particular electrolysis system at a particular port where you're planning to produce the ammonia for export to Japan.
So it both through increased transmission capacity and through the ability to store the power, you should be fine. Okay. My other
The other thing, Henry, that I might comment is that there's a big change in the recommendations in this Jewel paper relative to existing Chinese government plans. Existing Chinese government plans to deliver power to the coastal regions envisages, and they're already doing it, investing in high voltage DC and high voltage AC essentially from the west to the coast, from the south to the coast as well. And the argument that's coming out of our paper here is that, that maybe the real issue is going to be delivering power from the coastal regions to the periphery, and that's going to change the dynamics of how you invest in the transmission system. The other point that I think is worth bearing in mind is that the current, at least as far as we've seen it, the current Chinese government plan has not yet recognized the opportunity to develop this very, very large source of electricity from the offshore regions.
Okay, let me, we have a question and I'll just read it here. Given that China has virtually no infrastructure for storage and transport of green hydrogen, what are the cost assumptions regarding that? And are they included in your number of minus $1.6 a ton?
Okay, can you go back to the thing that shows the, this chart here is sort of a breakdown of how we do this. So we're looking at the production of hydrogen, green hydrogen from the electrolysis system. We're looking at the cost for storage. We're looking at the cost for conversion where that's appropriate, and we're also looking at the cost for transport. So we are trying to take care of all of those related issues. It's not just the cost of the electrolysis system; it's the cost of storing the hydrogen and also bringing the hydrogen to the port, where you have to have temporary storage of the hydrogen in the port before you put it on the ship. So the analysis does tend to take care of all those issues. It tries to.
So they would have to build this infrastructure, but you think fairly that they could do this fairly easily over a period of time? I mean, obviously,
that's our assumption. That probably realistically targeting post 2030 for this, but if they want to do it, I think they could do it. In a decade or two, and our perspective here is to go out to 2050. There's also an issue here that Henry, I'd be interested in your view and colleagues' view. I mean, there's an interesting political issue here. If we're sort of contemplating Chinese sources of hydrogen supplying projected demands for hydrogen in Japan, what does that do for the political economy of East Asia? I mean, there's been a long history of problems, hot problems and cold problems with Japan and China. So is this a realistic possibility?
Well, that was my next question to you, actually, is that I think that it's not only would it make significant changes in some of the geopolitical relationships, but given historical feelings between Japan and China, that this would be very hard, I think, to negotiate such a deal. I mean, they may take the penalty of buying the ammonia from Australia, rather than taking it from China, which would be a lot cheaper, simply because of geopolitical concerns.
I think that's a serious possibility. The other thing, I've talked about some of this green hydrogen stuff to a number of international groups, and one of the things that I've sort of speculated about is that the U.S. could become a major source of green hydrogen to Japan. I mean, we have more than sufficient opportunity to produce electricity from wind and solar. And, you know, if we're losing the market for exporting LNG and so on, well, maybe we could replace that market by sending Asia, Japan in particular, a source of green hydrogen we produce in the United States. I sort of mentioned this to a group that included former Governor Brown. I think I'm very excited about that.
No, I think that the whole emergence of trade in ammonia and or liquid hydrogen is going to emerge. How it will actually, what will look like in 2035, I don't know, but I think it's coming. Let me read the second question. How do we address the challenges of transporting hydrogen from where it's created, the electrolysis facility, to the end users? Studies into using the existing natural gas infrastructure have shown that the extreme pressure and much smaller molecular size of hydrogen lead to major losses in infrastructure built for natural gas. Do we need to create a completely new hydrogen distribution system?
Okay, I think that's a good question. I mean, the analysis that has been done suggests that if you're going to deliver the hydrogen through the natural gas distribution system, realistically, you can't expect to do it with more than maybe 4 or 5, 6% hydrogen in that system. But what we're doing here is we're not coupling this to the natural gas system. We're assuming that the hydrogen system delivered to Japan is essentially autonomous. I mean, you're going to deliver the hydrogen either in the form of ammonia or this toluene thing, and then you're going to use it and deploy it. One of the things, first thing we're going to do with this hydrogen when it gets to Japan is you're going to replace the current industrial source with this green hydrogen.
If we continue, if you have this great potential to build, to develop or produce green hydrogen, will it begin to replace existing thermal power in China? I mean, you talk about the export market, but there's a big domestic market. If you look at that, one of your tables there, where you can produce 3 to 4 to sometimes up in Hainan, it was 43 times the demand through offshore wind. That would tell me that you would be a significant substitution potential here. And I guess my two questions: one, why isn't China more aggressively pursuing this? And second, can you say a few words about what you would have to build in order to utilize all of this potential along the coast?
Again, very good questions. In terms of why it's not getting a great deal of immediate attention, I think it's just that it's so bloody new. I mean, it's I was blown away to find the results of this offshore lease off the coast of New England, and I think that the technology to deploy these the turbines to anchor them in sediments at a depth of water depths of less than 60 meters is really, it's a product of what they've done in Europe. It's been an amazing, successful activity in Scotland and in the North Sea, involving, incidentally, when you look at the partners involved, it involves people like Shell and BP, who are in fact actively involved in producing natural gas in the North Sea. So I think that the fact that it's a little slow is not terribly surprising. And what will be required to do it? Obviously, you will have to, thinking about it in the China context, you will have to have the port facilities that can service these offshore turbines. You will have to be able to have the technology to deliver the turbines and to anchor the turbines in the sediment. And that's going to take some time. And a good question is, since a lot of that technology is already available in Europe in particular, is that going to be a market for European investments in China? And I don't know that we know how that's going to go. But certainly building that infrastructure is going to be a significant expense and a significant commitment.
As someone who has worked with China for almost 3 decades, do you feel that the Chinese commitment to decarbonization is significant, or is it simply something that in order to keep being involved in the global dialogue on this issue, they are keeping their feet, they're making some steps in the direction, but it's still the main issue in China is economic growth. It's still employment growth, that they still haven't embarked on us with any sense of urgency on the climate problem, or is that sort of not true?
I think it's again a very interesting question. My experience in talking to Chinese government leaders, when we started having these conversations back in the 1990s, and we were talking, Chris and I were talking about climate, trying to get China to be serious about climate issues. The answer was always, look, it's your problem, not our problem. We're a developing country. Now that has changed, at least the rhetoric has changed. And it changed pretty dramatically when Xi and Obama had that conversation that led up to the Paris Accord. The question of whether China is serious about it, I've served on this China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development, which is, a very interesting organization. Half of the members of the council are foreign and half of the members are Chinese. But the council advises the Chinese premier on issues of environment and development. And what I have found over the years, particularly recent years, is that the Chinese government is talking green at the national level in a major way. So, for example, the announcement that Xi had a month or so ago that China would no longer invest in coal-fired power plants in the Belt and Road, even though that was sort of a hollow commitment since they weren't doing it anyway. It was not economical to do that. But it was an interesting indication of the rhetoric from the central government in China about green development. So the green development is a big deal. Then you get to the practicalities of, all seen this story about shortages of electricity in China over a recent period. We've also seen the fact that there's been a deficiency in coal-fired power plants, of fuel for coal-fired power plants. And we've all seen that this has been a significant impact on the lives of people, including having to turn down power for not just domestic situations, but also for industrial applications. I mean, Tesla, I think, some of the Tesla factories had to lost. The power was deprived for 2 days of the week. Okay, so what is really going on here? Well, the other thing that I find is that the Chinese turned down production of coal in a significant way, and also the price of electricity generated by coal was not economical compared to the increasing price of coal. So utilities, in order not to lose money, were simply turning off power. And I'm not quite sure where this is going to go. I mean, my sense is that there's a clash here. Clash number one is the central government has this commitment to dealing with the climate issue, but the central government also has a commitment to providing a reasonable source of electricity to customers. And I think the second one is going to win. I mean, I think that they're going to work as hard as they can to get more coal produced, to bring the price of coal down, and to work on that. And sort of take the attitude, okay, we've made a commitment for 2030 in terms of peaking. And okay, if we can't do that, we can't do it, but we have to worry about the economic considerations. And there's also, I think, a clash between the economics on the local level compared to the national level. I mean, local party cadres are rewarded based on what they do to GDP. And so the easiest way to bring GDP up is to build another coal-fired power plant and to produce more coal from the mines. So it's a moving target. I'm not quite sure we know what's going to happen. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens in Scotland. It's interesting that President Xi is not going there, right? As far as I know.
Right. There are a number of national leaders who are not going. But it will be interesting, particularly given that this increase in energy costs and shortage potential is worldwide now. It's not just China. And so we'll see what happens. Michael, I want to thank you very, very much for this. This is, you have given us a lot of food for thought here on a number of really interesting issues. So I really appreciate it. And I wish everybody to join me in thanking Michael. Next week, stay on China. Jackie Liu will be talking about cultivating climate, the U.S.-China relations, and global climate cooperation. So all of you, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next week. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Henry.